The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as 8-year-old Emily Martinez carefully adjusted her backpack straps beside her. A magnificent German Shepherd sat perfectly still, his dark eyes scanning the quiet suburban neighborhood. With the practiced awareness of a trained professional, Shadow wasn't just any dog, he was a retired canine officer, a hero who had served alongside Emily's father on the police force until that terrible day 2 years ago, when everything changed. For our walk, Shadow, Emily whispered, her small fingers finding comfort in the familiar texture of his service. Harnessed, the dog's tail gave a subtle wag, the only outward sign of the deep bond they shared. To everyone else, Shadow might look like an intimidating police dog, but to Emily, he was family, the last connection to her father, Officer Daniel Martinez, who had died in the line of duty there. Routine was sacred. Every afternoon after school, they would walk to Riverside Park, where Emily would read aloud from her favorite books while Shadow kept watch. Her mother, Sarah, often said that Shadow understood Emily in ways that even she couldn't. When the nightmares came, Shadow would rest his massive head on Emily's bed. When bullies at school made fun of her for being different, Shadow would walk her home with quiet dignity, as if he knew exactly what she needed today. Felt different, though Emily couldn't quite put her finger on why Shadow seemed more alert than usual. His ears pricked forward as they turned onto Park Avenue. The sidewalks were busy with the usual afternoon crowd: joggers, mothers pushing strollers, and teenagers on bikes. Everything appeared normal, peaceful. Even that's when the first police cruiser came around the corner, fast blue lights flashing but sirens silent, pulling up to the curb just ahead of them with a sharp screech of brakes. Emily's heart began to race as two officers emerged, their hands already moving toward their belts. She recognized the type immediately. Her father had taught her to read body language to understand when someone was truly there to help versus when they were looking for trouble. Officer Bradley Walsh was a thick-set man with small darting eyes that never seemed to settle on one thing for too long. His partner, Officer Janet Reeves, was younger but carried herself with the same aggressive posture. Both officers approached with purpose, and that purpose clearly wasn't friendly conversation. "Excuse me, little girl," Officer Walsh called out, his voice carrying an authority that made Emily instinctively step closer to Shadow. "We need to talk to you about that dog." Shadow immediately positioned himself between Emily and the approaching officers, his professional training kicking in automatically. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it was protective. The same stance he'd taken countless times when he'd worked alongside Emily's father. The dog's intelligent eyes assessed the situation with the cool professionalism of his training, and what he saw made him tense. "What about him?" Emily managed to ask, though her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She could feel Shadow's warmth against her leg, solid and reassuring. "That animal matches the description of a dangerous dog that attacked someone yesterday," Officer Reeves said, pulling out a small notepad. "We're going to need to take him in for questioning." His world tilted. Shadow, dangerous. The idea was so absurd it took her a moment to process. This was the same dog who gently carried her stuffed animals in his mouth when she was sad, who had never so much as growled at another person in all the time she'd known him. There must be some mistake, Emily said, finding her voice. "Shadow would never hurt anyone. He's a retired police dog. He used to work with my daddy before." "That's what they all say," Officer Walsh interrupted, taking another step forward. The movement caused Shadow to shift slightly, maintaining his protective position. "Look, kid, we don't have time for stories. We've got witnesses who described a German Shepherd matching this dog's description. Big, dark, trained to attack. Sound familiar?" Emily felt tears prick at her eyes. Around them, people were beginning to stop and stare. She could see phones being pulled out, the quiet murmur of conversation as bystanders tried to understand what was happening. "But he's my service dog," Emily protested, her voice breaking. "He helps me. He's never hurt anyone in his whole life." Officer Reeves stepped closer, and Shadow's low growl rumbled through his chest. Not a threat, but a warning. The sound was barely audible, but all three humans heard it clearly. "See that?" Officer Walsh said, pointing at Shadow. "Aggressive behavior. That's exactly what we're talking about. Janet, call for backup. This dog is clearly dangerous." "No," Emily cried out, wrapping her arms around Shadow's neck. "He's not dangerous. He's protecting me because you're scaring me." But the officers weren't listening. Officer Walsh had already unclipped his radio, speaking in the clipped professional tone that Emily remembered from her father's work. "Calls Unit 47 requesting animal control backup at the corner of Park and Maple. We have a potentially dangerous canine that needs to be contained." The crowd was growing, now drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion. Emily could hear whispers, fragments of conversation that made her stomach churn. "Poor little girl, that dog does look pretty fierce. Wonder what it did." Shadow remained perfectly still, his training evident in every line of his body. He wasn't showing any signs of actual aggression. No bared teeth, no raised hackles, no lunging or snapping, but Emily could feel the tension in his muscles, could sense his confusion at being treated as a threat by people who should have recognized him as one of their own. "Please," Emily whispered, looking up at the officers with tears streaming down her face. "Just call my mom. She can explain everything. Shadow is registered. He has all his papers. He was my daddy's partner on the force." Something flickered in Officer Walsh's eyes, not sympathy but something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, followed quickly by what might have been guilt, but the moment passed so quickly, Emily wondered if she'd imagined it. "Listen, kid," Officer Reeves said, her tone softening slightly. "We're just doing our job here. If your dog is innocent, then everything will work out fine, but right now we have a report, and we have to follow up on it." The sound of another siren approached, this one belonging to the animal control van. Emily's heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. They were really going to take Shadow away. They were going to separate her from the one friend who understood her completely, the one connection she still had to her father. The animal control officers began to approach with a catch pole and a transport cage. Shadow looked up at Emily with those wise dark eyes that had seen so much. For just a moment, she could swear she saw understanding there. Not just of the immediate situation, but of the bigger picture. He knew somehow that this was just the beginning. Miley clutched Shadow's harness tighter, feeling the strong, steady rhythm of his breathing. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it together. They had to. Because in a world that had already taken away so much, Shadow was all she had left of the family she'd once known. The afternoon sun continued to shine down on Maple Street, but for Emily Martinez and her loyal protector, the shadows were growing longer. The animal control van pulled up with mechanical precision, its diesel engine coughing to a stop as Officer Martinez watched her daughter's world begin to crumble. Sarah had been walking home from her job at the local library when she spotted the flashing lights and the growing crowd. The sight that greeted her made her blood run coldly. She called out, pushing through the circle of onlookers, who were recording everything on their phones, but Officer Walsh held up a hand to stop her approach. "Mom, please stay back. We're handling a dangerous animal situation here." "Dangerous animal?" Sarah's voice rose with indignation. "That's my daughter's service dog. Shadow is a retired canine officer. He's got more training and discipline than more training to attack you." "Mean?" Officer Reeves interrupted. "Look, lady, we understand you're upset, but we have multiple witnesses who identified this specific dog in connection with an attack yesterday evening. A jogger was severely mauled in Riverside Park." Riverside Park. Sarah felt her heart skip. Riverside Park. That was exactly where Emily and Shadow went every day after school, but the accusation was impossible to believe. "When yesterday evening?" Sarah demanded. "Because Shadow was with Emily and me from the time she got home from school until bedtime. We were at my mother's house for dinner." "I can prove it." Emily was sobbing now, her small arms wrapped around Shadow's neck while the dog stood perfectly still, his professional demeanor never wavering despite the chaos around him. Two animal control officers approached with their equipment. Heavy gloves, catch poles, and a transport cage that looked more like a prison cell. The attack happened around 7 p.m. Officer Walsh said, consulting his notes. Victim described a large German Shepherd, dark coloring, wearing what looked like a service harness. Shadow was nowhere near the park at 7 p.m. Sarah protested. "We were having dinner with my mother and her neighbors. There are at least 6 people who can vouch for that." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see that the officers weren't really listening. There was something in their expressions, a determination that went beyond simple procedure. This felt personal, though she couldn't understand why. Animal control officers, a weathered man named Jim Peterson, who had worked with dogs for over 20 years, approached cautiously. Unlike the police officers, he actually studied Shadow's body language and behavior. "This dog doesn't look aggressive to me," Peterson said quietly to his partner. "Look at his positioning. He's protective, sure, but there's no signs of actual aggression. No raised hackles, no lip curling, no tense muscle groups that would indicate attack readiness. Are you questioning our assessment?" Officer Walsh snapped. "We have a positive ID from witness sees him." "Just saying," Peterson continued. "I've seen aggressive dogs, and this isn't one of them. This dog is displaying textbook protective behavior, not predatory or aggressive behavior." Meanwhile, Emily had stopped crying and was looking around at the crowd with her father's analytical eyes. At 8 years old, she was already more observant than most adults, a trait her father had encouraged, and her mother had learned to respect. "Mom," she whispered, "something's wrong." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "The way they're acting, it's not like when Daddy used to investigate things. They're not asking the right questions." Sarah looked more closely at the officers. Emily was right there. With something off about their approach, real police work involved, thorough investigation, cross-referencing, facts, building a case. This felt more like they were working backward from a predetermined conclusion. "Officers," Sarah said, stepping forward. "Despite their protests, I want to see the witness reports. I want to know exactly what these people said they saw. That's not how this works." Officer Reeves said, "We don't share active investigation details with civilians." "Then I want to speak to your supervisor. This is harassment of a child," and her service animal. Officer Walsh's radio crackled, and Sarah caught fragments of the conversation. Something about keeping this quiet and wrapping it up fast. The pieces were starting to form a picture. She didn't like Shadow, meanwhile, had begun to show signs of stress. Not aggression, but the kind of anxiety any intelligent being would feel when surrounded by hostile strangers. His breathing had quickened slightly, and he was looking between Emily and the approaching animal control officers with clear concern. "It's okay, boy," Emily whispered in his ear. "I won't let them take you, I promise, but promises." Emily was learning weren't always enough to stop bad things from happening. The animal control officer with the catchpole was getting closer now, and Shadow's training kicked in. He gently pushed Emily behind him. Not roughly, but with the same careful protection he'd shown countless times before. The movement was so clearly defensive that several people in the crowd began to voice their objections. "Hey, that dog isn't being aggressive," called out Mrs. Chen from across the street. She'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years and had watched Emily and Shadow take their daily walks. "For months, he's just protecting the little girl." "This is wrong," added a teenage boy who'd been skateboarding past when the commotion started. "I've seen that dog around, he's never bothered anyone," but Officer Walsh seemed to interpret the crowd's growing sympathy as a threat to his authority. "Everyone needs to step back. Now this is an active police situation." "No," Emily said suddenly, her voice carrying a clarity that surprised everyone present. "This isn't police work. My daddy was a real police officer, and real police officers don't act like this." The words hung in the air, like an accusation. Officer Walsh's face reddened while Officer Reeves looked uncomfortable. "For the first time since arriving, your father's dead kid," Walsh said with shocking cruelness, "and his mutt is going to be put down for being dangerous. That's what happens to dogs that attack innocent people." The crowd gasped at the heartless comment, but Emily didn't break. Instead, she stood straighter, holding Shadow's harness with steady hands. "My daddy isn't dead," she said clearly. "He's a hero, and Shadow is a hero too, and heroes don't attack innocent people. They protect them." That's when Shadow did something that would haunt Officer Walsh for months afterward. The dog looked directly at him, not with aggression, not with fear, but with what could only be described as disappointment. It was the look of a professional recognizing someone who had abandoned their oath, someone who had forgotten what it meant to serve and protect. The animal control officers were reaching for Shadow now. Despite Jim Peterson's obvious reluctance, Sarah was arguing with increasing desperation while Emily held onto her best friend with trembling hands. And then Shadow made his choice. Instead of resisting or showing any sign of aggression, he gently nuzzled Emily's face, gave her one soft lick on the cheek, and then walked calmly toward the transport cage. He didn't fight, he didn't growl. He submitted to being taken away because he somehow understood that resistance would only make things worse for Emily. "No!" Emily screamed, lunging forward as they closed the cage door. "Shadow, come back!" The dog pressed his nose against the bars, whining softly, the first sound of distress he'd made. Through the entire ordeal, his dark eyes stayed locked on Emily's face. As they loaded him into the van, 48 hours, Officer Walsh said to Sarah as they prepared to leave. "That's how long you have to prove he's not the dog we're looking for." After that, he shrugged the gesture, somehow managing to be both threatening and dismissive. As the vehicles pulled away, Emily collapsed onto the sidewalk, sobbing with a grief that seemed too large for her small body. Sarah gathered her daughter in her arms, but her own mind was racing with something that felt dangerously close to rage. "We're going to get him back, baby," she whispered into Emily's hair. "I promise, we're going to get Shadow back." But as the crowd began to disperse and the ordinary world reasserted itself around them, both Emily and her mother were left with the terrible knowledge that promises weren't always enough to overcome injustice. Shadow was gone, and they had just 48 hours to prove his innocence in a system that seemed determined to find him guilty. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Shadow's face pressed against the bars of that cage, his dark eyes filled with confusion and worry. Not for himself, but for her. The empty dog bed in the corner of her room seemed to mock her with its silence. Sarah had spent the evening making phone calls, trying to navigate the bureaucratic maze of animal control procedures and police protocols. What she discovered made her increasingly suspicious of the officers' motives. "There's something wrong with this whole situation," she told her mother over the phone, while Emily pretended to be asleep. "The timeline doesn't match. The witness descriptions are vague, and the officers seemed more interested in taking Shadow than actually investigating what happened." "What are you going to do?" Grandma Elena asked. "I'm going to prove that Shadow couldn't have been involved, and I'm going to find out why those officers were so determined to take him in the first place." Next morning, Emily woke with the same determination burning in her chest. At breakfast, she pushed her cereal around the bowl, while her mind worked through the problem with the logical approach her father had taught her. "Mom," she said suddenly, "we need to go to the park, sweetheart. I don't think that's a good idea right now." "No, you don't understand. We need to see where it happened. Daddy always said you can't solve a case from your desk. You have to go to the scene and look for what doesn't fit." Sarah stared at her 8-year-old daughter, seeing Daniel's analytical mind reflected in Emily's serious brown eyes. "Okay, but we're not going alone." An hour later, they arrived at Riverside Park with Tony Vasquez, a private investigator who had worked with Daniel on several cases before his death. Tony was a quiet man with sharp eyes and infinite patience. "Exactly. The kind of person you wanted on your side when fighting an uphill battle. Show me where they say it happened, Tony said, pulling out a small digital camera. The three of them walked to the jogging path, where according to the police report, Sarah had finally managed to obtain a woman named Janet Morrison had been attacked by a large German Shepherd around 7 p.m. the previous evening. Here's what bothers me, Tony said, examining the scene. Look at this path. It's well lit, well traveled, right next to the main road. If a dog attack happened here at 7 p.m. on a weekday, there should have been dozens of witnesses. Emily was studying the ground with the intense focus she'd inherited from her father. Mr. Tony, look at this. She was pointing to a section of dirt beside the path where recent rain had left the ground soft and impressionable. There were footprints, human footprints. No paw prints. At all. If a dog attacked someone here, wouldn't there be paw prints? Emily asked. Tony smiled grimly. Smart girl. There should definitely be paw prints if a struggle took place on soft ground like this. They spent the next hour documenting everything: the lighting, the sight lines, the distance from the road, the condition of the ground. Sarah took notes while Tony photographed every angle, and Emily asked questions that would have impressed a seasoned detective. Their next stop was the small convenience store that sat at the corner near the park entrance. The owner, Mr. Kim, had known Emily and Shadow for months from their daily walks. I heard what happened, he said, sadly, when they entered. It's crazy. That dog is gentle, like a lamb, never causes trouble, always well behaved. Kim. Sarah said, do you have security cameras? Of course. Point at the park entrance, the parking area, most of the jogging path. Sarah's heart leaped. Can we see the footage from yesterday evening? Around 7 p.m. Mr. Kim pulled up the footage on his computer, and all three of them leaned in to watch. The timestamp showed 6:45 p.m., then 7 p.m., then 7:15 p.m. The jogging path was clearly visible, along with several joggers and dog walkers moving through the frame. Stop, Emily said. Suddenly go back to 7 o'clock. They watched a crucial time period 3 times. At exactly 7 p.m., a woman matching Janet Morrison's description jogged into frame. From the left side of the screen, she was alone, moving at a steady pace, looking perfectly normal. No dog was visible anywhere in the frame. At 7:03 p.m., the same woman jogged back through the frame, heading in the opposite direction, still alone, still appearing completely uninjured. This doesn't make sense, Sarah said. The police report says she was attacked at 7 p.m., but the security footage shows her jogging normally at that exact time. Tony was already copying the footage to a flash drive. Either the police report is wrong, or something else is going on here. Their investigation continued throughout the day. They spoke to regular joggers who used the path, dog owners who frequented the park, and neighbors who lived near the scene. Not one person had heard any commotion, screaming, or sounds of a struggle the previous evening. More troubling, no one had seen Janet Morrison after her attack. She hadn't gone to the hospital. She hadn't filed a detailed statement with the police. In fact, she seemed to have completely disappeared after making her initial report. By evening, Emily and Sarah had compiled a folder of evidence that cast serious doubt on the entire case against Shadow, but when they tried to present it to the police department, they were met with cold indifference. Look, lady, the desk sergeant said, without even looking at their evidence, the case is being handled by officers Walsh and Reeves. They're not in right now, and they don't take Walkinston. When can we see them? Sarah demanded. They'll be in touch if they need anything from you. The police station. Emily looked up at her mother with tears in her eyes. They don't want to know the truth, do they? Sarah knelt down to hug her daughter, feeling the weight of injustice pressing down on both of them. Sometimes people make mistakes, sweetheart, and sometimes they're too proud to admit it. But Shadow only has one more day, Emily whispered. That night, as Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she overheard her mother on the phone with Tony. There's something bigger going on here, Sarah was saying. Walsh's behavior today, the way they rushed to take Shadow without proper investigation, the missing victim, it doesn't add up. Eve. Been thinking the same thing, Tony replied. I did some digging into Walsh's background. Did you know? He had several complaints filed against him for excessive force, and one of them involved a K9 unit. Emily sat up in bed, her heart pounding. A K9 unit like Shadow and her father. What happened? Sarah asked. 3 years ago, Walsh was involved in a drug bust that went wrong. A K9 officer and his dog were killed because Walsh broke protocol and went in without backup. The officer's name was Daniel Martinez. The phone line went silent. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out loud. That's Emily's father, Sarah finally whispered. I know. And I'm starting to think this isn't about a dog attack at all. I think Officer Walsh has been looking for a way to get revenge on Daniel Martinez, and now he's taking it out on Daniel's family. As Emily processed this revelation, something cold and determined settled in her chest. This wasn't just about proving Shadow's innocence anymore. This was about stopping a corrupt police officer from destroying her family out of spite and guilt. Was Shadow's last day, but Emily Martinez wasn't going to let her father's partner become another victim of the man who had failed them. She was going to save Shadow no matter what it took. The clock on Emily's bedside table read 11:47 p.m. when she heard the muffled conversation from her mother's room down the hall. Sarah was on the phone with Tony again, her voice tight with desperation. The hearing is set for 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, her mother was saying. If we can't prove Shadow's innocence, by then they're going to. The sentence trailed off, but Emily knew how it ended. Melly slipped out of bed and crept to her door, pressing her ear against the wood to hear better. The problem is that Walsh and Reeves have control of the narrative. Tony's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Every piece of evidence we've presented gets dismissed or explained away. The security footage has technical issues. The witness statements are unreliable. They've built a wall around this case that we can't penetrate through official channels. So what are you saying? Sarah asked Skeetium, saying that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, good people have to make hard choices. And didn't wait to hear the rest. She already knew what needed to be done. If the adults couldn't save Shadow through proper channels, then she would have to find another way. Moving with the quiet stealth her father had taught her during their games of hide-and-seek, Emily gathered her supplies. A small backpack, a flashlight, the spare key to her bike lock, and most importantly the photo of her father in his police uniform that she kept on her nightstand. In the photo, her father was kneeling beside Shadow, both of them in their prime, partners in every sense of the word. "I'm going to bring you home," she whispered to the photo. Both of you. Molly waited until she was sure her mother was asleep before slipping out through the back door. The night was cool and quiet, with only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog to break the silence. She retrieved her bike from the garage and began the longest ride of her young life. The animal control facility was located in an industrial area on the outskirts of town, a squat concrete building surrounded by chain-link fencing. Emily had looked up the address online while pretending to do homework earlier that evening. The bike ride took 45 minutes, and by the time she arrived, her legs were shaking from exertion and adrenaline. She hid her bike behind a dumpster and approached the building carefully. Security was minimal, just a few floodlights and basic locks on the doors. This wasn't a high-security prison. It was just a place to hold stray animals until their owners could reclaim them, or until Emily pushed that thought away and focused on the problem at hand. The building had windows, but they were high and barred. The main entrance was locked, as were the side doors. She tried, but around back she found a loading dock with a roll-up door that didn't quite reach the ground. The gap was maybe 18 inches tight, but not impossible for a small 18-year-old. Millie wriggled under the door, scraping her back on the concrete as she pulled herself through. Once inside, she clicked on her flashlight and began to search for Shadow. Animal control facility was a maze of concrete corridors lined with kennels. Most were empty at this late hour, but a few contained dogs that had been picked up as strays or surrenders. The sound of Emily's footsteps on the concrete floor caused a few to stir and whine softly. She found Shadow in a kennel at the far end of the building, and her heart broke at the sight of him. The proud, confident police dog she knew had been replaced by a confused and anxious animal who was trying to maintain his dignity in an impossible situation. But when he saw Emily's flashlight beam, his tail began to wag. With desperate hope, "Shadow," she whispered, running to his kennel. "I'm here, boy. I'm going to get you out." Shadow pressed his nose against the chain-link door of his kennel, whining softly with relief. Emily examined the lock. It was a simple padlock, but she didn't have the key. She tried pulling on it, twisting it, even hitting it with a loose piece of concrete she found on the floor, but nothing worked. Tears of frustration began to roll down her cheeks. She had come so far, risked so much, and now she was stopped by a simple lock. "Sorry, boy," she whispered. "I don't know how to. Having some trouble there." Emily spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the far end of the corridor, flashlight beam dancing on the walls. For a terrifying moment, she thought it was Officer Walsh, come to arrest her for breaking and entering. But as the figure approached, Emily realized it was an older man she didn't recognize. He was tall and lean, with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore civilian clothes, but something about his posture and the way he carried himself reminded Emily of her father. "Please don't call the police," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I know I'm not supposed to be here, but they're going to kill Shadow tomorrow, and he didn't do anything wrong. And easy there, kiddo," the man said gently. "I'm not going to call anyone. My name is Captain Robert Hayes, retired. I used to work with your father." Emily's eyes widened. "You knew my daddy?" "Daniel Martinez was one of the best officers I ever had the privilege to serve with," Captain Hayes said. "And Shadow here was his partner for 3 years. They saved a lot of lives together. Then you know he would never hurt anyone." "I know it, and you know it, but unfortunately, that's not enough to save him through official channels." Captain Hayes pulled a keyring from his pocket. "Lucky for Shadow, unofficial channels can sometimes be more effective." Emily watched in amazement as Captain Hayes unlocked Shadow's kennel. The dog bounded out and immediately began covering Emily's face with grateful licks, his tail wagging so hard his entire body shook with joy. "How did you know I would be here?" Emily asked as she hugged Shadow. "Title: I've been following this case since yesterday," Captain Hayes said. "When I heard that Daniel Martinez's daughter and his partner were being targeted by Walsh, I knew I had to do something. I've been waiting for the right moment to been watching Officer Walsh." Captain Hayes's expression darkened. "Walsh has been a problem for years. He's corrupt, vindictive, and dangerous. What he's doing to your family is just the latest in a long line of abuses of power. They began walking toward the exit, Shadow staying close to Emily's side, but as they reached the main corridor, they heard the sound of car doors slamming outside, followed by heavy footsteps approaching the building. There, here, Captain Hayes said grimly, someone must have seen the lights or heard the dogs barking. Emily's heart sank as she heard familiar voices through the walls. Officer Walsh and Officer Reeves, along with at least one other person. Is there another way out? Emily whispered. Captain Hayes shook his head. They'll have the building surrounded by now. But don't worry, have a plan. The front door of the facility burst open, and Officer Walsh stormed in with his gun drawn, followed closely by Officer Reeves and a security guard. No, you're in. Here, Walsh shouted, come out now, and nobody gets hurt. Captain Hayes stepped into the main corridor, his hands visible but relaxed. Evening, Walsh working late tonight. Hayes. Walsh's voice was full of surprise and suspicion. What the hell are you doing here? I could ask you the same question. Breaking into a municipal facility in the middle of the night isn't exactly standard police procedure. Got a call about a break-in, Officer Reeves said, though her voice lacked conviction. Torily. From who? Because I've been here for the past 2 hours and I haven't seen any evidence of a break-in. Captain Hayes' voice carried the authority of his years of experience, and Emily could see the younger officers becoming uncertain. Where's the girl? Walsh demanded. We know she's here. What girl? Captain Hayes asked innocently while this conversation was happening. Emily had pressed herself against the wall in the side corridor, Shadow beside her. She could hear every word, and she realized that Captain Hayes was buying her time. But for what? But for what? The answer came in the form of sirens approaching from outside, multiple vehicles by the sound of it, and not just police cars. Emily heard the distinctive rumble of news vans and the chatter of what sounded like a crowd gathering. Captain Hayes smiled. Sounds like the cavalry has arrived. Through the windows, Emily could see flashing lights and the bright glare of television camera lights. Somehow Captain Hayes had arranged for the media to be present at exactly the right moment. You son of a bitch. Walsh snarled. You set this up. I did what I had to do to protect an innocent child and her service dog from a corrupt police officer who was abusing his power for personal revenge. Captain Hayes said calmly, and now the whole city is going to know about it. Officer Walsh raised his gun, pointing it directly at Captain Hayes. I should shoot you right now for interfering with a police investigation. Go ahead, Captain Hayes said, without flinching. With all those cameras outside, it should make for some interesting footage. Emily realized this was her moment. While all attention was focused on the standoff between Captain Hayes and Officer Walsh, she and Shadow could make their escape. But as she started to move, Shadow suddenly stepped in front of her, blocking her path. A dog was looking toward the main corridor with intense focus, his ears perked forward and his body tense. He had sensed something that Emily had missed. Officer Reeves was moving to flank them, trying to cut off their escape route. Good boy, Emily whispered, understanding immediately what Shadow was trying to tell her. Instead of running toward the exit, Emily made a different choice. She stepped out into the main corridor, Shadow at her side, and walked directly toward the 3 adults who held guns and badges and the power to destroy her life. Right here, she said in a clear, strong voice that carried her father's courage. And Shadow is with me, and we're not running anymore. The sight of the small girl and the magnificent police dog standing together in the harsh fluorescent light of the animal control facility created a moment of perfect clarity. Here was innocence confronting corruption, loyalty facing betrayal, and truth standing up to lead. Walsh looked at Emily, then at Shadow, then at Captain Hayes, and for just an instant, his mask of righteousness slipped. In that moment, everyone in the room could see exactly what he was: a bitter, failed man, taking out his guilt and anger on a child. And her dog outside. The crowd was growing louder, and Emily could hear her mother's voice calling her name. The media had arrived, the story was getting out, and there was no way to contain it, and Captain Hayes had orchestrated the perfect trap, and Officer Walsh had walked right into it. Over Walsh, Captain Hayes said quietly, the whole city is watching. What happens next is up to youth. Standoff in the animal control facility lasted only seconds longer, but to Emily it felt like an eternity. Officer Walsh's hand trembled as he kept his weapon pointed at Captain Hayes, his face cycling through emotions. Rage, fear, desperation, and finally, defeat. The sound of the front door opening broke the tension as Sarah Martinez burst into the building, followed by Tony Vasquez, and what appeared to be half the local news media. Camera lights blazed to life, illuminating the surreal scene. A retired police captain facing down a corrupt officer while an 8-year-old girl stood protectively beside her father's former canine partner. Emily, Sarah cried out, rushing toward her daughter before being stopped by Officer Reeves. Ma'am, this is an active police situation. Reeves began, but her words were cut off by Captain Hayes. Actually, Officer Reeves, this stopped being a police situation the moment you and your partner decided to fabricate evidence and abuse your authority. Captain Hayes reached into his jacket, causing Walsh to tense, but he only pulled out a manila folder. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I have something you're going to want to see. Dant, you dare, Walsh snarled, but his authority was evaporating with each passing moment. The presence of the media had shifted the power dynamic completely. Captain Hayes opened the folder and held up a series of photographs. These are surveillance photos taken from multiple locations around Riverside Park. On the evening of the alleged attack, they show clearly that Shadow was nowhere near the park at the time in question. Emily watched as one of the news cameras zoomed in on the photos. Even from her position, she could see the timestamp and the clear absence of any large dog in the park during the crucial time. Furthermore, Captain Hayes continued, his voice carrying the measured authority of decades in law enforcement. I have sworn statements from 6 witnesses who can confirm that Emily Martinez and her service dog were at a family dinner during the entire evening of the supposed attack. The alleged victim, Janet Morrison, appears to have been coached in her statement and has since disappeared from her listed address. That's enough, Walsh shouted, but his outburst only made him look more desperate on camera. Captain Hayes wasn't finished. Most importantly, I have documented evidence that Officer Walsh has been systematically harassing the Martinez family as part of a personal vendetta related to the death of Officer Daniel Martinez 3 years ago. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. Her father's death. This was all connected to her father's death. Daniel Martinez died because Walsh here broke protocol during a drug bust, Captain Hayes explained to the cameras, his voice heavy with old grief and fresh anger. Instead of waiting for backup, as ordered, Walsh went in alone and triggered a firefight that resulted in the death of both Officer Martinez and his canine partner, Rex, rather than face the consequences of his actions. Walsh blamed the canine unit for the failed operation and has harbored a grudge against police dogs and their handlers ever since. Emily felt Shadow press against her leg, offering comfort as the terrible truth about her father's death was revealed. Her father had died not as a hero charging into danger, but as a victim of another officer's recklessness and cowardice when he learned that Daniel's daughter had been given Shadow as a therapy animal after her father's death. Captain Hayes continued. Walsh saw an opportunity for revenge. He fabricated this entire case to have Shadow destroyed, knowing it would devastate the Martinez family all over again. The assembled media was recording every word, and Emily could see the shock and disgust on the reporters' faces as they realized the scope of the corruption they were witnessing. Sarah had managed to push past Officer Reeves during the revelation and was now kneeling beside Emily, her arm around her daughter's shoulders while her other hand rested on Shadow's head. Is this true? Asked Maria Santos, a veteran reporter from Channel 7 News, pointing her microphone at Officer Walsh. Did you fabricate evidence against this little girl's service dog as part of a personal vendetta? Walsh looked around the room like a cornered animal. His partner, Officer Reeves, had quietly holstered her weapon and taken a step away from him, her face pale with the realization of what she had unknowingly participated in. Was following up on a legitimate complaint, Walsh said, but his voice lacked any conviction. A complaint from a witness who doesn't exist at a location where no crime occurred, Captain Hayes said. The only legitimate question here is whether you'll face charges for filing false reports, harassment, and abuse of power. That's when Shadow did something that surprised everyone in the room. The dog walked slowly toward Officer Walsh, not with aggression or fear, but with the measured dignity of his police training. He sat down directly in front of Walsh and looked up at him with those intelligent, dark eyes that had seen so much. For a moment, the room was completely silent, except for the whir of camera motors and the distant sound of the crowd outside. He's not angry at you, Emily said suddenly, her voice clear in the silence. Shadow doesn't get angry. He just does his job. Even when people are mean to him, he just does his job. Sir Walsh stared down at the dog, this living reminder of the partner he had failed, the good man whose death was on his hands. Shadow simply sat there, patient and professional, offering no judgment, no accusation, just the quiet dignity of a true police officer. Walsh's gun hand dropped to his side, and Emily saw something break inside the man, whether it was shame, grief, or simply exhaustion from carrying guilt for so long. The fight went out of him complete. Eliam. Sorry, he whispered, though it wasn't clear if he was speaking to Benio Shadow, to Emily, or to the ghost of Daniel Martinez. I'm so goddamn sorry. Officer Reeves moved quickly to take Walsh's weapon. As he sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands, the drama that had consumed Emily's life for the past 2 days was ending, not with violence or shouting, but with the quiet collapse of a man who had been destroyed by his own demons. Hayes knelt down beside Emily, his voice gentle. Your father would be very proud of you, you know? You fought for Shadow the same way he would have fought for what was right. Emily looked at Shadow, who had returned to her side and was sitting at attention, like the professional he had always been. Does this mean Shadow gets to come home? Shadow was never going anywhere, Captain Hayes said with a smile. All charges have been dropped and there will be a full investigation into this department's handling of the cases. They prepared to leave the animal control facility, Emily noticed Officer Reeves approaching hesitantly. I want you to know, Reeves said quietly to Sarah. I had no idea what Walsh was really doing. I thought we were following up on a legitimate complaint. If I had known you were just doing your job, Sarah replied, though. Her tone remained cool, but maybe next time, do it better. Outside, the crowd had grown to include neighbors, friends from school, and dozens of people who had simply heard the story and come to show their support. Mrs. Chin from the convenience store was there with flowers. Mr. Peterson from Animal Control was there with an official letter clearing Shadow of all charges. Even some of Emily's classmates had come with their parents to welcome Shadow home. As they walked through the crowd toward Sarah's car, Emily felt Shadow's presence beside her, like an anchor of strength and love. The nightmare was over, but more than that, she had learned something important about herself and about the world. Sometimes good people had to fight for what was right. Sometimes the system failed, and individuals had to step up. Sometimes even 8-year-old girls and their dogs could make a difference when they refused to give up. The drive home was quiet, with Shadow sleeping peacefully in the back seat. For the first time in days, as they pulled into their driveway, Emily saw that someone had tied yellow ribbons around the oak tree in their front yard, dozens of them fluttering in the morning breeze like tiny flags of victory. "Welcome home, boy," Emily whispered as Shadow stretched and wagged his tail inside the house. Everything was exactly as they had left it 2 days ago, but somehow it all looked different. Shadow's water bowl, his favorite toy, his bed in the corner, these simple things now seemed precious beyond measure. Emily sat on the living room floor, and Shadow immediately settled beside her, his head resting on her lap. Sarah knelt down and wrapped both of them in her arms, and for several minutes they simply held each other. In the quiet sanctuary of their home later that evening, Captain Hayes called with an update. Officer Walsh had been suspended pending a full investigation and would likely face criminal charges. Officer Reeves had been reassigned and was cooperating fully with internal affairs. The police chief had personally apologized to the Martinez family and promised a complete review of the department's procedures. More importantly, Captain Hayes had arranged for Shadow to receive an official commendation for his years of service, along with Daniel Martinez, whose reputation had been fully cleared of any wrongdoing in the operation that had cost him his life. "There's going to be a ceremony next month," Captain Hayes told them. "Shadow will be honored, alongside some of the other retired K-9 officers who have served the community. I think Daniel would have liked that." As Emily got ready for bed that night, Shadow followed her to her room and settled into his bed in the corner, the same spot he had occupied every night since coming to live with them, but which had seemed so empty just 24 hours earlier. "Shadow," Emily said as she turned off the light, "thank you for being brave, thank you for not giving up, and thank you for taking care of me, just like Daddy asked you to." The dog's tail thumped softly against his bed, and Emily could swear she heard him sigh with contentment. Outside, Maple Street was quiet under the streetlights. The police cars were gone, the media had moved on to other stories, and the neighborhood had returned to its peaceful routine. But in the small house at the end of the block, a little girl and her loyal protector slept soundly, knowing that they had faced down injustice. And in her dreams that night, Emily saw her father in his police uniform standing beside Shadow in a field of golden sunlight. Both of them were young and strong and proud partners in the truest sense of the word. "Take care of each other," her father said in the dream, his voice warm with love. That's what partners do. When Emily woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming through her bedroom window, and Shadow was sitting patiently by her bed, ready for their morning walk. His dark eyes were bright with intelligence and affection, and his tail wagged with the quiet joy of a job well done. They were free, they were safe, they were home, and they were together.